I'm Marcus Richardson, 47 years old, and 3 days ago I woke up from a coma to discover my entire life had been stolen. For 3 years, while I lay unconscious in a private medical facility, my identical twin brother Daniel has been living as me, running my companies, sleeping in my bed, and spending my $45 million fortune. The doctors told me I'd been in a car accident, that Daniel had been caring for me this whole time. But when I looked at my bank statements, when I saw the wedding photos on my phone of Daniel marrying my fiancée Sarah, when I realized he'd sold 2 of my properties and fired half my employees, I knew the truth. This wasn't care. This was the perfect crime. My own brother didn't just steal my identity while I was fighting for my life. He erased me completely, and everyone I trusted helped him do it. But Daniel made one critical mistake. He underestimated how much fight I had left in me. If you've ever been betrayed by family, you'll want to hear this story. Like and subscribe because what I'm about to tell you will change how you see blood relations forever. The first thing I noticed wasn't the fluorescent lights burning my eyes, or the antiseptic smell that seemed to coat my throat. It was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of sleep, but the hollow emptiness of a place where time had stopped mattering. Long ago. Mr. Richardson, can you hear me? The voice belonged to a woman in scrubs, whose face I didn't recognize. Her name tag read Dr. Sarah Williams, but she spoke to me like we were old friends. You've been unconscious for 3 years. Marcus, your brother Daniel has been here every day, waiting for this moment. 3 years. The words hit me like ice water. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like sandpaper. The last thing I remembered was driving home from the office on a Tuesday evening in March 2022. Now, according to the calendar on the wall, it was April 2025. Your recovery is miraculous, Dr. Williams continued, checking my vitals with practiced efficiency. The traumatic brain injury from your accident. We honestly didn't expect you to regain consciousness. Daniel never gave up hope though. He's been your legal guardian, making all your medical decisions. Such a devoted brother. Legal guardian. The phrase sent an uncomfortable chill through me. Daniel and I were identical twins, but we'd never been particularly close. He was the charming one, the one who could talk his way out of any situation. I was the one who worked 8 days building my business empire. Why would he suddenly become my devoted caretaker? Where is Daniel now? I managed to croak. He's handling some business matters in the city. He calls twice daily for updates. I've already contacted him about your awakening. He should be here within a few hours. She paused, studying my chart. Marcus, I need to prepare you. Your life has continued during your absence. Daniel has been managing everything. Your businesses, your finances, your personal affairs. He's done an admirable job keeping everything together. Something in her tone felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this speech. I wanted to ask more questions, but exhaustion was already pulling me back toward unconsciousness. As Dr. Williams adjusted my I caught a glimpse of papers clipped to my chart, even upside down and blurry. I could make out the header, Power of Attorney Daniel Richardson, full legal authority. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, but something about it felt wrong. The handwriting was too neat, too deliberate. I'd signed thousands of documents over the years, and my signature was always a rushed scrawl, barely legible after the first letter of each name. But that was impossible. I'd been unconscious for 3 years. How could I have signed anything? Dr. Williams noticed my stare, and quickly flipped the chart closed. Rest now, Marcus. You have a long recovery ahead of you. Daniel will explain everything when he arrives. As she left the room, I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, counting water stains and trying to process what I'd learned. 3 years of my life, gone. My brother, who I'd spoken to maybe twice a year, suddenly my devoted guardian. And somewhere out there, my life had been continuing without me. I should have felt grateful. Daniel had stepped up when I needed him most, kept my world from falling apart while I fought my way back to consciousness. So why did every instinct I had tell me that something was terribly, dangerously wrong? The phone they gave me felt foreign. In my hands, 3 years of technological advancement had passed me by, but muscle memory guided my fingers to the unlock screen. What I saw there made my blood freeze. My face stared back at me from dozens of photos, but none of them were memories I possessed. There I was at what looked like a wedding ceremony, kissing a woman in white. Sarah, my Sarah. But I had never married her. We'd been engaged, planning our wedding for the fall of 2022, the wedding I'd missed by 3 years because I'd been unconscious in this sterile prison. I scrolled through the images with trembling fingers. Every photo was a knife twist. There was I cutting a cake, I dancing with Sarah, I surrounded by friends and family at what should have been the happiest day of my life. But the man in those photos wasn't me. It was Daniel, wearing my life like a perfectly tailored suit. My Instagram account showed 3 years of a life I'd never lived. Vacation photos from places I'd never been. Paris, Tokyo, the Maldives, pictures of me at business conferences, shaking hands with clients I'd spent years cultivating. Images of romantic dinners, weekend getaways, anniversary celebrations, all of it featuring my face, but none of it featuring my soul. The captions were written in my voice, or what someone thought was my voice. Grateful for another year with my beautiful wife. Closing another major deal? Blessed to do what I love? Life is perfect when you have the right person beside you. Each post had hundreds of likes, dozens of comments from people congratulating me on my happiness, my success, my perfect life. People I'd known for years, celebrating milestones with an imposter. My chest tightened as I realized that everyone I cared about had been interacting with Daniel, thinking it was me. I found Sarah's number in my contacts and almost called her, but stopped. What would I even say? Hi, I know you think you've been married to me for 2 years, but actually you've been living with my twin brother while I was in a coma. She'd think I was having some kind of psychotic break. Instead, I checked my banking apps. The numbers made me dizzy. My checking account, which had held $2.3 million before the accident, now showed $847,000. My investment portfolio had been restructured completely, with stocks I'd never heard of, replacing the carefully researched positions I'd built over years. 2 of my rental properties were gone, sold, according to the transaction history, for below market value, but it was the address changes that hit me hardest. Daniel had moved out of his cramped downtown apartment and into my penthouse. He was sleeping in my bed, wearing my clothes, living my life down to the smallest detail. He'd even changed his driver's license and passport to match my address. The most chilling discovery was my social media activity patterns. For 3 years, I had been posting regularly, responding to comments, maintaining relationships with friends and business associates. The posts showed intimate knowledge of my personality, my mannerisms, my way of speaking. Daniel hadn't just stolen my identity, he'd studied me, memorized me, perfected me. A notification popped up on the screen. A text from Sarah. Just heard the news from Daniel. Can't wait to see you, my love. The doctors say you might not remember everything at first, but we'll get through this together. I've missed talking to the real you, the real me. The words were a slap across the face. For 3 years, Sarah had been living with an imposter, and she'd been so thoroughly deceived that she'd developed an emotional attachment to him. Daniel hadn't just stolen my money and my property. He'd stolen my relationships, my connections, my entire social existence. I set the phone down with shaking hands. Dr. Williams had been wrong about one thing. My life hadn't continued during my absence. My life had been murdered and replaced with a carefully constructed lie, performed by the one person in the world who could pull off such a deception. My identical twin brother had committed the perfect crime, and everyone I loved had helped him do it without even knowing. The laptop Dr. Williams brought me felt like opening Pandora's box. Every click revealed another layer of Daniel's systematic destruction of everything I'd built. My hands shook as I logged into my business accounts, dreading what I'd find. Richardson Consulting, my flagship company, was bleeding money. The bank statements showed a pattern of increasingly reckless spending that made my stomach turn. Daniel had authorized $300,000 in marketing expenses to companies I'd never heard of. He'd given himself a salary increase of 40%, while cutting the pay of my most experienced employees. The quarterly reports showed we'd lost 3 major clients in the past year alone, but it was the investment portfolio that truly revealed the scope of his incompetence. I'd spent 15 years building a diversified portfolio worth $18 million before the accident. Now it was worth $6 million, and the losses weren't from market downturns. Daniel had made catastrophically bad decisions, chasing schemes that any financial advisor would have warned against. He'd put $2 million into a cryptocurrency that had collapsed within 6 months. Another $1.5 million had gone into a tech startup that existed only on paper. I couldn't even find a website for the company. The most painful discovery was that he'd sold all my blue-chip stocks, the conservative investments that had provided steady returns for years, to fund these gambling ventures. My real estate portfolio was even worse. The downtown office building I'd purchased for $3.2 million had been sold for $2.8 million, a loss of $400,000 on a property that should have appreciated significantly. The beachfront condo in Miami, my favorite retreat, was gone for $200,000, less than I'd paid for it. Both sales had happened within the last 18 months, right when the real estate market was hitting new highs. The property transaction records showed Daniel's forged signature on every document. He'd practiced my handwriting well enough to fool the title companies and banks, but more disturbing were the buyer details. Both properties had been sold to shell companies that I couldn't trace. Had Daniel been laundering the money, or was he simply so desperate for cash that he'd sold to the first bidders? My personal accounts painted an even grimmer picture. The $2.3 million I'd carefully saved had been systematically drained. Large cash withdrawals, luxury purchases, expensive dinners, and travel. Daniel had been living like a king on my money, spending more in 3 years than I'd spent in the previous 10. Credit cards I'd never applied for showed massive balances. Daniel had opened accounts in my name, maxing them out on designer clothes, jewelry, and electronics. My credit score, once pristine, had dropped to fair territory due to late payments and high utilization rates. He'd even taken out a $500,000 line of credit against my remaining properties. The most infuriating discovery was a series of loans to family members. Daniel had given our cousin Mike $50,000 for a business venture that had immediately failed. Our Uncle Robert had received $25,000 for emergency medical expenses that insurance should have covered. Even our parents had been recipients of Daniel's generosity with my money, $100,000, for home renovations they'd never asked me for. But it was the wedding expenses that broke my heart. Daniel had spent $85,000 on his wedding to Sarah, charging everything to my accounts, the venue, the flowers, the photographer, the honeymoon in Bali. He'd married the woman I loved, using money I'd earned, creating memories that should have been ours. Each transaction was a betrayal, but together they painted a picture of something even worse than theft. Daniel hadn't just stolen my money, he'd stolen my entire financial future. Years of careful planning, disciplined saving, and smart investing had been undone by 3 years of reckless spending and poor decisions. I closed the laptop and sat in the sterile hospital room, calculating the damage. Of my $45 million net worth, Daniel had managed to lose or steal over $12 million. My businesses were failing, my properties were gone, and my credit was ruined. Even if I could prove the fraud, recovering from this financial devastation would take years. But money could be earned back. Trust, once broken, was irreplaceable. And Daniel had shattered every relationship, every bond, every connection that had mattered to me. He'd stolen more than my wealth, he'd stolen my life itself. Dr. Williams had left a box of my personal belongings on the bedside table. Among my wallet, watch, and keys was something that made my chest tighten, a photo album Sarah must have brought, thinking it would help with my recovery. The leather cover was embossed with Richardson family memories in gold lettering. I opened it with trembling fingers, and there we were, Daniel and me, at age 5, identical down to the cowlick that refused to stay down. Our mother had dressed us in matching sailor suits for the photo, but even then, you could see the difference in our eyes. Mine were serious, focused on the camera with typical 5-year-old intensity. Daniel's sparkled with mischief, his smile just a little too knowing for his age. Page after page told the story of our parallel lives. Little League Baseball, I was the one who practiced every day, but Daniel was the one who got picked for the all-star team because the coach liked his personality better. School plays I memorized my lines perfectly, but Daniel got the lead role because he could improvise when other kids forgot their parts. Even our birthday parties showed the pattern. I would plan elaborate themes and activities, but Daniel would somehow become the center of attention, charming the other kids with his natural charisma. The high school photos were the most painful. There we were at graduation, both valedictorian candidates. I had the higher GPA by a fraction of a point, but Daniel gave the speech because he was more personable. According to the principal, college acceptance letters, we both got into the same schools. But Daniel chose the state university because college is about the experience, not just the education. While I went to MIT because I knew it would set me up for success, our parents' favoritism had been subtle but consistent. In family photos, Daniel was always positioned more prominently. At family dinners, his stories got more attention and laughter. When we both brought home girlfriends, Daniel's were always delightful while mine were nice enough. It wasn't that they didn't love me, they just loved him more. The album showed our diverging paths through our 20s. Daniel bouncing between jobs, always quitting when things got difficult, while I ground through 60-hour weeks building my first consulting business. Daniel's social media presence was constant parties, vacations, new relationships, while I was too busy working to maintain much of an online presence. He was the twin everyone wanted to hang out with. I was the one they called when they needed something fixed. But the most revealing photos were from family gatherings. In every single one, Daniel was surrounded by relatives, telling stories, making people laugh. I was usually on the periphery, checking my phone or having a quiet conversation with one person. Even when I was paying for the gatherings, which happened more and more as my business grew, Daniel was the star of the show. The pattern was clear. I was the achiever, but Daniel was the beloved. I built success, but he attracted people effortlessly. I had money and accomplishments, but he had something I'd never possessed, the ability to make people want to be around him. Looking at these photos, I understood why Daniel's deception had worked so perfectly. It wasn't just that we looked identical, it was that people had always preferred him to me anyway. When he started living as me, he became the version of Marcus Richardson that everyone had always wanted. Successful, like me, but charming like him. The last photo in the album was from Christmas 2021, just 3 months before my accident. Daniel and I were standing together, arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling at the camera. But I remembered that day differently. We'd had an argument about money again. Daniel had asked for a loan to start another business venture, his 4th failed attempt at entrepreneurship. I'd refused. Tired of bankrolling his dreams while he criticized my obsession with money? "You have everything," he'd said that day, his voice bitter. "Money, success, Sarah, this perfect life. And you're still not happy. You don't even appreciate what you have. I worked for everything I have, I'd replied, maybe if you stopped expecting handouts and started putting in the effort. Effort. He'd laughed, but it was cold. You think? I haven't put in effort. Do you know how exhausting it is being the disappointment? Being the twin who didn't make it? Living in your shadow every single day? Our mother had interrupted the argument, insisting we take the photo for the album. We'd put on fake smiles and posed together, but the resentment in Daniel's eyes was unmistakable. I'd dismissed it as sibling rivalry, the natural friction between twins who'd taken different paths. Now, staring at that photo, I saw it for what it really was. The face of a man who'd spent his entire life wanting what his brother had. Daniel hadn't just stolen my identity on impulse when I fell into a coma. He'd been preparing for this moment his whole life, watching me, studying me, waiting for his chance to become me. And when that chance came, when I was at my most vulnerable, he'd taken everything I'd worked for and made it his own. The perfect twin had finally found a way to be perfect by becoming me. Lying in that hospital bed, I forced myself to remember who I really was before Daniel's theft. The business formation documents in my memory were as clear as if they were printed on paper in front of me. Richardson Consulting, LLC, filed March 15, 2009. Initial investment, $5,000. From my savings account and a credit card cash advance that kept me awake at night. I'd started the company in my studio apartment, working 18-hour days while Daniel was bartending and dating his way through the city. My first client was a struggling restaurant that needed help streamlining their operations. I charged him $500 for a week's work that saved them $50,000 annually. Word spread slowly, painfully, through referrals and cold calls that left my voice hoarse every night. The early years were brutal, while Daniel bounced from job to job, always finding reasons why each workplace was toxic or didn't appreciate his talents. I was building something real. I lived on ramen noodles and coffee, reinvesting every penny back into the business. When Daniel was out partying, I was studying supply chain management, learning new software, taking online courses in business optimization. By 2012, I had 3 employees and an office that wasn't my apartment. By 2015, we were handling Fortune 500 consulting contracts. The company that started with a desperate $5,000 investment was generating $2 million in annual revenue. But success came at a cost that Daniel never understood. I missed family gatherings because I was traveling to client sites. I turned down dates because I was working weekends, while Daniel charmed everyone at Christmas dinner with stories about his latest adventures. I was in the corner answering urgent emails. Our parents would shake their heads sympathetically. Marcus works too hard. But they deposited the checks I sent for their mortgage payments without complaint. The real estate investments started in 2016. I'd saved enough for a down payment on a duplex in an up-and-coming neighborhood. Daniel mocked me for wasting money on a dump, but I could see the potential. Within 2 years, the property had doubled in value. I bought another, then another, always choosing carefully, always thinking long-term. Each property purchase was a calculated risk backed by months of research. I studied neighborhood development plans, crime statistics, school ratings, transportation projects. While Daniel made impulsive decisions based on feelings, I built spreadsheets and financial models. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Meeting Sarah in 2019 changed everything. She was a marketing director for one of my clients. Brilliant and beautiful in a way that made me forget about spreadsheets for the first time in years. Our first date lasted until sunrise, not because we were partying, but because we couldn't stop talking about business strategy and our dreams for the future. Sarah understood my drive in a way Daniel never had. She didn't see my work ethic as obsession. She saw it as passion. When I showed her my 5-year plan, she didn't roll her eyes. She asked how she could help. For the first time, I had someone who wanted to build something together instead of just enjoying what I'd already built. We moved in together in 2020, combining our complementary skills to take both our careers to the next level. Sarah's marketing expertise helped Richardson Consulting land bigger contracts. My financial planning helped her launch her own consulting practice. We were partners in every sense of the word, building toward a future that excited both of us. The engagement ring cost $50,000, not because I wanted to show off, but because Sarah deserved something as beautiful and enduring as what we were. Building together, I proposed on the balcony of my penthouse. The city lights spread out below us like a promise of everything we could accomplish together. We're going to change the world, she'd whispered that night, and I believed her. We had the skills, the drive, and the resources to make a real difference. Our wedding was planned for October 2022, followed by a honeymoon in Europe, and then serious discussions about starting a family. But it wasn't just love that made those years special. It was the satisfaction of earning everything through hard work. Every client trusted us because we delivered results. Every property investment paid off because I'd done the research. Every dollar in my accounts represented hours of effort, careful decisions, and calculated risks. By early 2022, my net worth had reached $45 million. Richardson Consulting employed 37 people. My real estate portfolio included 12 properties across 3 states. I'd gone from a desperate young man with a credit card cash advance to a self-made millionaire who could provide for the people he loved. Daniel watched all of this happen from the sidelines, always quick with criticism, but never willing to put in the work. "You're missing out on life," he'd say when I declined his party invitations. "Money isn't everything," he'd lecture when I chose business trips over family vacations. But as I lay in that hospital bed, remembering the pride of building something from nothing, I realized Daniel had been wrong about everything. The empire I'd built wasn't just about money, it was about security, freedom, and the ability to take care of the people I loved. It was about proving that hard work and smart decisions could overcome any obstacle. Daniel had inherited all the benefits of my success without understanding the sacrifice and discipline that created it. He'd stolen the results without comprehending the process, and that's why he was destroying everything I'd built. Because he'd never learned that maintaining success was even harder than achieving it. The laptop's browser. History became my detective tool. Someone had been researching my accident recently, Daniel, presumably, covering his tracks or refreshing his memory of the official story. The police report was still accessible through the county website, and what I read made my blood run cold. According to Officer Martinez's report, filed March 23, 2022, I had been driving home from the office around 8:30 p.m. when my BMW struck a concrete barrier on Highway 52, single-car accident. No witnesses except for Daniel, who happened to be driving behind me and called 911 immediately. The investigating officer noted that road conditions were clear, weather was good, and there were no signs of mechanical failure. But the details didn't add up. The report stated I was unconscious when paramedics arrived, suffering from severe head trauma. Daniel told police I'd been working long hours and seemed exhausted lately. He suggested I might have fallen asleep at the wheel. Case closed, file archived. I remembered that night differently. I'd left the office at 7:45 p.m. after a successful client call. I wasn't tired, I was energized. We just landed a $2 million contract extension, and I was driving home to share the good news with Sarah. I'd planned to take her to dinner to celebrate. I was careful, alert, completely sober. More troubling was the timing. What were the odds that Daniel would be driving on the same highway, at the same time, right behind me? According to the report, he lived 15 miles in the opposite direction from my office. There was no logical reason for him to be on that stretch of Highway 52 at that time of night. I searched for Daniel's phone records from that evening, but they'd been sealed as part of the investigation. However, I found something almost as revealing. In the insurance claims, my BMW's black box data showed I'd been traveling at exactly the speed limit with no sudden acceleration or braking before impact. The collision angle suggested I'd hit the barrier straight on, not at the angle you'd expect from someone falling asleep and drifting off the road. The medical reports were even more suspicious. The paramedics' initial assessment noted severe head trauma but also mentioned unusual bruising on my neck and arms that wasn't consistent with the car accident. Those observations had been dismissed by the emergency room doctor, who focused on the obvious head injury and didn't investigate further. But it was the towing company records that provided the most damning evidence. Daniel had specifically requested that my car be towed to Murphy's salvage instead of the police impound lot. He'd paid extra for immediate processing, ensuring the vehicle was crushed within 48 hours before any detailed forensic examination could be performed. I found Murphy's business license and called them directly. The owner, Frank Murphy, remembered the case because of Daniel's urgency. "Your brother was real anxious to get that car processed," Frank told me. "Said it was too painful for the family to see it sitting around. Paid cash for expedited service. Most people want time to collect personal items, but he said there was nothing worth saving, personal items." My laptop had been in that car, along with client files, financial documents, and personal photos. Daniel had ensured everything was destroyed before anyone could examine it closely. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that my accident wasn't accidental. Daniel had been struggling financially in early 2022. His bartending job barely covered his rent, and he'd been rejected for several business loans. Our last conversation before the accident had been him asking for money again, a request I'd firmly denied. "You can't keep expecting me to bail you out," I'd told him. "At some point, you need to take responsibility for your own life." His response had been cold. "Easy to say when you have everything handed to you." Handed to me? I'd been incredulous. "I've worked for every dollar I have." "Sure, Marcus. Keep telling yourself that. Some of us aren't lucky enough to be born with all the advantages." I'd hung up frustrated, but not worried. Daniel's resentment was nothing new. I'd never imagined it could turn deadly. Now, piecing together the evidence, a horrifying picture emerged. Daniel hadn't just been in the right place at the right time to help after my accident. He'd been in the perfect position to cause it. The neck bruising could have been from a struggle before I lost consciousness. The straight-in collision could have been the result of deliberate sabotage. And 3 years later, he was living my life so completely that no one questioned his right to make medical decisions about my care. He'd had 3 years to perfect his story, to build relationships as me, to establish himself so thoroughly in my identity that my awakening was more inconvenient than joyful. The police report was more than just inadequate investigation, it was evidence of the perfect crime. Daniel had attempted murder, committed identity theft, and stolen millions of dollars, all while being praised as the devoted brother who never gave up hope. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated my determination to uncover the truth. Dr. Williams returned the next morning with discharge papers and a nervous energy that immediately put me on alert. She avoided eye contact as she explained my care plan and the transition process back to normal life. But it was the private medical facility contract in my file that revealed the true scope of Daniel's conspiracy. Peaceful Valley Extended Care wasn't a hospital, it was a private facility specializing in long-term care for patients with minimal hope of recovery. The contract, signed by Daniel as my legal guardian, specified that I was to receive comfort care only with limited medical intervention. In other words, Daniel had deliberately chosen a place where I would be kept alive but not actively treated for recovery. Dr. Williams, I said carefully, how many coma patients at Peaceful Valley have regained consciousness in the past 5 years? Her hand stilled on my chart. That's not really relevant to your case, Marcus. Humor me. Very few. The patients we typically see have suffered severe, irreversible brain damage. Recovery like yours is unprecedented. So Daniel specifically chose a facility where patients don't wake up. Your brother was told your prognosis was very poor. Peaceful Valley specializes in making patients comfortable when aggressive treatment isn't warranted. But I'd already found the smoking gun in the facility's billing records. Daniel hadn't just chosen Peaceful Valley for its low recovery rates, he'd negotiated a special arrangement. Instead of the standard family visitation policies, he'd requested complete privacy for my care. No other family members, no friends, no business associates were allowed to visit. Even Sarah had been told that seeing me in my condition would be too traumatic and potentially harmful to my recovery. The facility's location was another piece of the puzzle. Peaceful Valley was 3 hours outside the city, hidden away in a rural area where no one from my normal life would accidentally encounter me. Daniel had told everyone I was receiving specialized treatment at a private facility, but had never provided the specific location or contact information. Dr. Williams had been Daniel's accomplice. Whether knowingly or not, the medical records showed she'd been reporting my condition to him twice daily for 3 years. But those reports painted a picture of a patient with no hope of recovery. According to her notes, I showed no signs of cognitive awareness and had minimal brain activity consistent with persistent vegetative state. Dr. Williams, your notes indicate I've been essentially brain dead for 3 years. How do you explain my current condition? She fidgeted with her pen. Brain injuries are unpredictable. Sometimes patients surprise us. But you told Daniel I would never recover. You've been telling him that for 3 years. I gave him realistic expectations based on the information available. What information? Who provided my initial medical assessment? Her silence was damning. I pulled up the transfer records on the laptop and found the answer. I hadn't been brought to Peaceful Valley directly from the hospital. I'd been transferred from Metro General after only 48 hours of treatment. The transfer had been requested by Daniel against the recommendation of the emergency room physicians, who wanted to continue aggressive treatment for my head injury. The Metro General records showed a completely different picture. Dr. Patricia Chen, the attending neurologist, had noted significant brain activity and recommended continued monitoring with the expectation of potential recovery. Her final note, dated March 25, 2022, read, "Patient shows promising signs of neurological activity. Transfer to long-term care facility not recommended at this time. Further treatment warranted." Daniel had overruled a trained neurologist's medical opinion and moved me to a facility where recovery was neither expected nor encouraged. He'd essentially condemned me to a living death while he lived my life. But the conspiracy went deeper than just medical fraud. The financial arrangements at Peaceful Valley were unusual. Instead of billing my insurance for standard rehabilitation services, Daniel had negotiated a flat monthly fee for custodial care. The difference in cost was substantial. Rehabilitation would have cost $300,000 annually, while custodial care was only $120,000. Daniel had saved $540,000 over 3 years by ensuring I received substandard care. The saved money had gone directly into his pocket. Insurance had paid the custodial care fees, but Daniel had been billing my estate for the full rehabilitation costs and keeping the difference. He'd literally been profiting from my medical neglect. I found emails between Daniel and the facility administrator discussing my special circumstances. Daniel had expressed concern about privacy and the need to protect patient confidentiality. Due to my high-profile business position, in reality, he'd been paying extra to keep me isolated and ensure that my condition remained a secret from anyone who might question his authority. The staff at Peaceful Valley had been told I was estranged from my family and business associates. Due to personal issues before the accident, Daniel was presented as my only close relationship, the devoted brother who'd stepped up when everyone else had abandoned me. The staff genuinely believed they were helping a caring family member. During a difficult time, Dr. Williams' involvement became clearer as I read through her communications with Daniel. She'd been providing him with detailed medical updates that he'd used to maintain his deception. When business associates asked about my condition, Daniel could provide specific medical terminology and realistic timelines that convinced people he was truly caring for me. Most chilling were the contingency plans I found in Daniel's notes. If I had died during my coma, he'd arranged for a simple cremation with no autopsy. My death certificate would have listed the car accident as the cause, and Daniel would have inherited everything as my next of kin. He'd literally been waiting for me to die while living my life, but I'd survived, and now his perfect crime was unraveling. Dr. Williams' nervous behavior suggested she was beginning to understand her role in the conspiracy. The facility's records would prove medical fraud and insurance fraud. Daniel's financial arrangements would demonstrate his motive for keeping me incapacitated. The conspiracy wasn't just about stealing my identity, it was about ensuring I could never reclaim it. Daniel had created a prison disguised as medical care, and everyone involved had believed they were helping rather than harming. Everyone except Daniel, who'd orchestrated the entire scheme with sociopathic precision. The first person I called was Jennifer Martinez, my former executive assistant. According to the termination letter I'd found in my email archives, Daniel had fired her 18 months ago for performance issues and failure to adapt to new management style. I knew Jennifer well enough to know that was complete nonsense. She'd been with the company for 6 years, and was one of the most competent people I'd ever worked with. Her voice was cautious when she answered. "Marcus, is this really you?" "It's me, Jen, the real me. We need to talk." 2 hours later, she was sitting in my hospital room, tears streaming down her face as I explained what had happened. Jennifer's story filled in crucial gaps in my understanding of Daniel's deception. "I knew something was wrong from the beginning," she said. "When you came back from your medical leave, you were different. You made decisions without research. You were rude to longtime clients. You started every morning by checking your appearance in the mirror. The real Marcus never cared about his hair." She pulled out a folder she'd been carrying. "I saved these before they fired me. I thought something was wrong, but I couldn't prove it." The documents were explosive. Jennifer had kept copies of emails, financial records, and meeting notes that showed the systematic destruction of my business. Daniel had alienated 3 major clients by failing to deliver promised results. He'd hired expensive consultants for projects we could have handled internally. Most damaging, he'd restructured employee contracts to reduce benefits while increasing his own compensation. "The other employees started calling you New Marcus behind your back," Jennifer explained. "Everyone noticed the personality change, but we figured the accident had affected your brain somehow. Sarah kept saying you were still recovering, and to be patient." Sarah. The name hit me like a physical blow. How much did she know? Nothing. "I think she was devastated after your accident. Daniel told everyone you were in a specialized brain trauma facility, and that the doctor said recovery was unlikely. She grieved for you, Marcus. Real, heartbreaking grief. When Daniel started comforting her, everyone thought it was sweet how he was helping her through the loss." Jennifer described the slow progression of Daniel's relationship with Sarah. "He'd started by bringing her updates about my condition. Then he began inviting her to dinner because you would want someone to take care of her. Within 6 months, they were spending every evening together, with Daniel playing the role of supportive brother. She fell in love with him, thinking he was you recovering from brain trauma," Jennifer said. "The personality changes were explained as effects of the accident. When he proposed, everyone thought it was romantic how your near-death experience had made you more emotional and spontaneous." The employee termination letters revealed Daniel's strategy for eliminating anyone who might question his identity. Jennifer wasn't the only one fired. Robert Chen, my IT director, had been terminated for asking too many questions about security protocols. Maria Santos, my senior accountant, was let go for challenging management decisions. Anyone who knew me well enough to spot inconsistencies in Daniel's behavior had been systematically removed from the company, but not everyone had been fooled. Jennifer gave me contact information for 3 employees who'd been fired and were willing to talk. Each had their own story of suspicious behavior and personality changes they'd noticed in Marcus after the accident. Asterisk, Robert Chen had been fired after questioning why Daniel needed access to archived financial records from before the accident. The real Marcus knew every detail of the company's financial history, Robert told me over the phone, but he kept asking me to pull old records and explain deals he should have remembered. When I suggested he might want to see a doctor about memory problems, he fired me the next day. Maria Santos had noticed discrepancies in Daniel's signature on financial documents. His handwriting was similar, but not identical. I mentioned it to him, thinking maybe the accident had affected his motor skills. He got angry and said I was questioning his competence. 2 weeks later, I was terminated for insubordination. The pattern was clear. Daniel had fired anyone with the knowledge and attention to detail necessary to expose his fraud. But he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd created a group of former employees who were angry, suspicious, and motivated to help me reclaim my life. Jennifer had already started reaching out to current employees who might be willing to help. People are scared to speak up because jobs are hard to find, but there's a lot of resentment building up. The company culture has become toxic under Daniel's leadership. He rules through intimidation rather than collaboration. The current financial state of Richardson Consulting was even worse than I'd realized. Daniel had lost 4 more clients in the past 6 months through incompetence and unprofessional behavior. Employee turnover was at an all-time high, with experienced consultants leaving for competitors. The company's reputation in the industry had suffered significantly, but Jennifer's most valuable contribution was her insider knowledge of Daniel's routines and vulnerabilities. She'd observed his habits during the 18 months she'd worked under his management, noting his weaknesses and blind spots. He's paranoid about being found out, so he over-researches everything, she explained. He keeps detailed notes about your personal history, your business relationships, even your preferences for food and entertainment. But he doesn't understand the emotional connections you had with people. He treats relationships like business transactions. Jennifer had also noticed Daniel's drinking problem, which had developed since he started living my life. The pressure of maintaining the deception was getting to him. He'd started drinking during lunch meetings and keeping a bottle in his office. The real Marcus was never a heavy drinker. The stress of the fraud was taking its toll in other ways too. Several employees had commented on Marcus's mood swings and paranoid behavior. He'd installed security cameras throughout the office and started requiring employees to log their activities in unusual detail. He was acting like a man who expected to be caught. Jennifer's final revelation was the most encouraging. Several current employees suspected something was wrong and were documenting incidents they found suspicious. If I could provide them with proof of Daniel's fraud, they'd be willing to testify about the behavioral changes and questionable decisions they'd witnessed. You still have allies in the company, Marcus, people who remember what you were really like and want to see the company succeed again. We just need evidence to prove what we all suspect. As Jennifer prepared to leave, she handed me a business card. This is Detective Sarah Wilson with the Fraud Division. She's a friend of mine, and I told her I might have information about identity theft. She's willing to listen if you're ready to file charges. For the first time since waking up, I felt hope. Daniel's conspiracy was unraveling, and I wasn't alone in the fight to reclaim my life. The perfect crime was about to become a perfect disaster for him. Detective Sarah Wilson arrived at the hospital that evening with a briefcase full of questions and a recording device. Jennifer had briefed her on the basics, but the detective's expression shifted from skeptical to shocked as I laid out the evidence of Daniel's elaborate fraud. Mr. Richardson, what you're describing is one of the most complex identity theft cases I've ever encountered, she said, reviewing the documents Jennifer had provided, but the medical fraud angle is what really concerns me. Let's start with your medical records. That's when we discovered the most damning evidence yet. Daniel had been bribing medical staff to falsify my records. Dr. Williams' nervous behavior suddenly made sense when Detective Wilson showed me the forged medical records Daniel had been using to justify his guardianship. According to the falsified documents, I had suffered severe and irreversible brain damage with no possibility of cognitive recovery. The brain scans attached to these records weren't even mine. They showed massive trauma inconsistent with my actual injury. Someone had substituted scans from a different patient to support Daniel's claims about my hopeless condition. Your brother needed these records to maintain legal guardianship and to satisfy insurance companies, Detective Wilson explained. Without proof of severe brain damage, he couldn't have made major financial decisions on your behalf. The forged medical records had been the foundation of Daniel's entire scheme. He'd shown them to Sarah to convince her I was essentially dead. He'd presented them to my business partners to justify taking over my companies. He'd used them with banks and insurance companies to authorize major financial transactions. But the medical fraud went deeper than just paperwork. Dr. Williams finally broke down and confessed her role in the conspiracy when Detective Wilson threatened her with criminal charges. The truth was horrifying. Daniel had been paying her $5,000 monthly to keep me sedated and to report that I showed no signs of recovery. He told me you had no family except him, and that keeping you comfortable was the kindest option. Dr. Williams sobbed. He said aggressive treatment would only prolong your suffering. I thought I was being compassionate. The sedation explained why my recovery had taken so long. My brain had actually been healing normally, but the drugs Daniel had authorized were keeping me unconscious. I should have awakened within months of the accident, but Daniel had been paying to keep me in an artificial coma while he established himself and my life. Detective Wilson's investigation revealed that Daniel had researched the medical fraud extensively before implementing it. His browser history showed searches for maintaining coma patients, legal guardianship for brain injury, and falsifying medical records. He'd even joined online forums for families dealing with brain trauma to learn the appropriate medical terminology. The insurance fraud was massive. Daniel had been billing my insurance for expensive rehabilitation services while I received only basic custodial care. Over 3 years, he'd stolen over $400,000 in fraudulent medical claims. The insurance companies had paid without question, because the forged medical records supported the treatment claims. But Daniel's medical conspiracy required multiple accomplices. Detective Wilson identified at least 3 other medical staff members who'd been receiving payments to maintain the deception. The night shift supervisor had been paid to ensure I wasn't monitored too closely. A laboratory technician had been falsifying blood test results to support the sedation protocol. Even the facility's administrator had accepted money to maintain unusual privacy restrictions around my case. The web of corruption extended to legal professionals as well. Daniel had paid a paralegal $10,000 to expedite the guardianship paperwork and ensure it wasn't reviewed too carefully by the court. The lawyer who'd filed the guardianship petition had been told I was estranged from other family members and that Daniel was my only caring relative. Detective Wilson's team found evidence that Daniel had been planning this fraud long before my accident. His financial records showed he'd been researching private medical facilities and guardianship laws for months before the crash. He'd even consulted with lawyers about hypothetical scenarios involving twin brothers and medical decision-making. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, Detective Wilson concluded. Your brother had been planning to steal your identity for months. The accident just gave him the perfect excuse to implement his plan. The forged medical records were so convincing that even some legitimate medical professionals had been fooled. When Sarah had insisted on a second opinion about my condition, Daniel had arranged for her to meet with a neurologist who'd been shown only the falsified records. The doctor had confirmed Daniel's claims about my hopeless prognosis, not knowing he was looking at fabricated evidence. The most chilling discovery was Daniel's contingency planning. If I had died during the extended coma, he'd arranged for my death certificate to list the original car accident as the cause. There would have been no autopsy, no investigation, no questions about the medical treatment I'd received. He would have inherited everything legitimately, and no one would have suspected murder. But keeping me alive, while incapacitated, had been even more profitable. As my legal guardian, Daniel had access to all my assets without the complications of probate, court, or inheritance taxes. He could spend my money freely while maintaining the fiction that he was caring for me. Detective Wilson estimated that Daniel's total theft exceeded $15 million when accounting for stolen funds, insurance fraud, property sales, and business losses. But the medical conspiracy added additional federal charges including healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and falsifying federal documents. Your brother isn't just a thief, Detective Wilson said grimly. He's attempted murder through medical neglect, committed massive fraud, and corrupted multiple healthcare professionals. This is going to be a federal case with serious prison time. The forged medical records were the smoking gun that would bring down Daniel's entire conspiracy. But first, we needed to gather enough evidence to ensure that all his accomplices faced justice and that every stolen dollar could be recovered. Web of lies was unraveling, but Daniel didn't know it yet. He was still living my life, still playing the devoted brother, still believing his perfect crime was secure. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Detective Wilson arranged for me to observe Sarah from a distance before making direct contact. I needed to understand how deeply Daniel's deception had affected her, and what I saw broke my heart more than anything he'd stolen from me. Sarah was leaving the coffee shop where we'd had our first date 3 years ago. She looked older, more fragile than I remembered. Her blonde hair was shorter, her face thinner, and there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She walked with the careful steps of someone carrying invisible weight. Jennifer had retrieved Sarah's personal journal from our shared apartment. Daniel had moved into my penthouse but kept some of my things in storage. Reading Sarah's private thoughts felt like an invasion, but I needed to understand what Daniel had put her through. The early entries after my death were devastating. March 30th, 2022. Marcus is gone. The doctors say he'll never wake up, never be the man I fell in love with. Daniel says I should say goodbye, that holding on is just hurting myself. But how do you say goodbye to your future? How do you let go of everything you planned to build together? April 15th, 2022. Went to see Marcus today. Daniel was right, it's too painful. He doesn't look like himself. The machines, the tubes, the complete stillness. That's not my Marcus. My Marcus was always moving, always thinking, always planning our next adventure. This broken shell isn't him. May 8th, 2022. Daniel brought dinner again. He's been so kind, taking care of everything while I fall apart. He tells me stories about Marcus as a kid, helping me remember the good times instead of dwelling on this nightmare. I don't know what I'd do without his support. The progression was heartbreaking to read. Daniel had slowly, methodically replaced me in Sarah's life while she grieved for the man she thought she'd lost. He'd comforted her, supported her, gradually made himself indispensable to her emotional survival. August 12th, 2022. Something happened today that I can't explain. Daniel was telling me about a business meeting, and for a moment, I could have sworn it was Marcus talking. The same excitement, the same way of describing challenges and opportunities. Daniel says twins often have similar mannerisms, especially when they're talking about something Marcus cared about. It's comforting, like having a piece of Marcus still here. October 3rd, 2022. Daniel kissed me tonight. I should feel guilty, but I don't. It felt like coming home, like Marcus was somehow still with me. Daniel says he's felt the connection to, and maybe this is what Marcus would have wanted for someone who loved him to take care of me. Is it wrong to find love in the middle of such loss? Daniel had manipulated her grief, used her vulnerability to insert himself into the space I'd left behind. He'd convinced her that loving him was a way of honoring my memory, that I would have wanted them to find comfort in each other. The wedding entries were the hardest to read. June 15, 2023. I married Daniel today. Everyone says Marcus would be happy that we found love together, that he'd want me to move on and be happy. Daniel wore Marcus's cufflinks, the ones I bought him for his birthday. When I saw them I cried, but Daniel said it was Marcus's way of being at our wedding. I want to believe that's true. Sarah had genuinely believed she was honoring my memory by marrying my twin brother. Daniel had convinced her that their relationship was a tribute to me rather than a betrayal. He'd used my own possessions, my own words, my own personality traits to seduce the woman I loved. But the recent entries revealed cracks in Daniel's performance. January 8, 2025. Daniel forgot our anniversary today. The Marcus I knew would never have forgotten something that important. When I reminded him, he got angry and said he's been under a lot of stress. But Marcus handled stress differently. He'd planned something special to make up for mistakes, not get defensive about them. February 14, 2025. Valentine's Day was disappointing. Daniel bought expensive gifts, but they weren't thoughtful. Marcus always gave me things that showed he really listened to what I wanted. A book by an author I'd mentioned once, tickets to a show I'd talked about months earlier. Daniel's gifts feel like he's trying to buy my happiness instead of understanding it. March 20th, 2025. I found cocaine in Daniel's jacket pocket today. When I confronted him, he said it was for a client meeting, that business sometimes requires compromises. The Marcus I knew would never have used drugs or associated with people who did. Something feels wrong, but I can't put my finger on what. Sarah's instincts were telling her that the man she'd married wasn't the man she'd fallen in love with, but she'd been attributing the changes to trauma from the accident. Daniel had been getting sloppy, letting his true personality show through the mask he'd worn so carefully. The final entries were the most painful. April 10th, 2025. I dream about the real Marcus almost every night now. In my dreams, he tells me something is wrong, that I need to wake up and see the truth. When I told Daniel about the dreams, he got upset and said I was living in the past. But what if the dreams are trying to tell me something? April 18th, 2025. Daniel came home drunk again last night and called me by another woman's name, Rebecca. When I asked who Rebecca was, he claimed he never said it, but I heard what I heard. Marcus never lied to me, never made me question my own perceptions. Who is the man I married? Sarah had been questioning her reality, sensing that something fundamental was wrong with her marriage but unable to identify what. Daniel's drinking and drug use were symptoms of the stress he was under, maintaining his deception. But to Sarah, they seemed like personality changes from brain trauma. Reading her journal, I realized that Sarah was as much a victim of Daniel's crime as I was. She'd been mourning me for 3 years, while unknowingly living with my attempted murderer. Her grief was real, her love for me was genuine, and her confusion about my changed behavior was completely understandable. Daniel hadn't just stolen my identity, he'd stolen Sarah's ability to trust her own instincts. He'd gaslighted her into accepting a reality that her heart knew was wrong. He'd made her complicit in his deception by convincing her that questioning him meant betraying my memory. The woman I'd planned to marry was still in there, still loving me, still mourning the life we'd planned together. She just didn't know that the man she'd lost was actually still alive, fighting his way back to her. But Daniel's mask was slipping, and Sarah was starting to see through his lies. Soon, she'd learn the truth about what had really happened to the love of her life. Jennifer had managed to retrieve the board meeting minutes from Richardson Consulting's past 3 years. Documents that painted a devastating picture of Daniel's systematic destruction of everything I'd built. Reading through them was like watching someone burn down my life's work, one decision at a time. The first red flag appeared in the minutes from June 2022. Just 3 months after my accident, Daniel had proposed restructuring the company culture to be more dynamic and responsive to market changes. In plain English, he was firing everyone who knew me well enough to question his identity. Board meeting minutes, June 15, 2022. CEO Richardson expressed concern about legacy employees who were resistant to necessary changes following his medical leave. Proposed reduction in workforce to improve efficiency and eliminate institutional inertia. My senior partners had initially resisted. Tom Bradley, who'd been with the company since 2015, had argued that our experienced team was our greatest asset. According to the minutes, Daniel's response was telling. Sometimes a near-death experience gives you clarity about what really matters. I've realized we've been too sentimental about personnel decisions. Tom had been outvoted when Daniel convinced the other board members that his new perspective after the accident was driving necessary improvements. Within 6 months, Tom himself had been forced out through a hostile restructuring of his partnership agreement. The pattern continued throughout 2022 and 2023. Every employee who questioned Daniel's decisions was labeled as resistant to change or stuck in old methodologies. He'd created a culture of fear where disagreeing with the CEO was career suicide, but it was the client. Relationship disasters that truly showed Daniel's incompetence. The minutes from September 2022 documented the loss of Morrison Industries, a $2 million annual account I'd spent 4 years developing. Board meeting minutes. September 8, 2022. CEO Richardson reported that Morrison Industries terminated their contracts citing unprofessional conduct and failure to deliver promised results. Richardson attributed this to clients' unrealistic expectations and stated, "We're better off without difficult clients." I knew Morrison's CEO personally. We'd built a relationship based on trust, reliability, and consistent results. Daniel had destroyed that relationship in 6 months through arrogance and incompetence, then blamed the client for his failures. The corporate spending during Daniel's reign was obscene. The minutes showed approval for a $150,000 office renovation that included a private executive bathroom with marble fixtures. Daniel had justified this as improving company image and employee morale, but it was really about feeding his ego. He'd also approved massive salary increases for himself while cutting benefits for lower-level employees. His compensation had jumped from $300,000 annually to $500,000. Plus bonuses and expense accounts that added another $200,000. Meanwhile, the company had eliminated health insurance subsidies and reduced retirement matching. The board had initially questioned these changes, but Daniel had manipulated them masterfully. He'd claimed that his brush with death had taught him the importance of executive leadership, compensation, and attracting top talent. He'd convinced them that underpaying the CEO was false economy. Most damaging were Daniel's strategic decisions that betrayed his fundamental misunderstanding of our business model. Richardson Consulting had succeeded by building long-term relationships with clients and delivering customized solutions. Daniel had tried to convert us into a volume-based operation, focused on quick turnarounds and standardized services. Board meeting minutes March 20, 2023. CEO Richardson proposed expansion into cryptocurrency consulting and NFT marketing services. When questioned about company expertise in these areas, Richardson stated that innovation requires taking calculated risks and that traditional consulting is dying. We'd lost $400,000 chasing cryptocurrency clients who either couldn't pay their bills or disappeared entirely. The NFT marketing division Daniel created had produced exactly 0 successful campaigns before being quietly dissolved 6 months later. But the most revealing minutes came from December 2024, when Daniel's paranoia had reached dangerous levels. Board meeting minutes, December 12, 2024. CEO Richardson expressed concerns about industrial espionage and competitor infiltration, proposed implementation of comprehensive surveillance system and mandatory polygraph testing for all employees. Board voted to table this proposal pending legal review. Daniel had been so worried about being exposed that he'd wanted to polygraph his own employees. His guilt and paranoia were making him increasingly unstable and authoritarian. The financial performance under Daniel's leadership was catastrophic. Annual revenue had dropped from $12 million to $6 million. Profit margins had collapsed due to his expensive mistakes and poor client retention. The company's credit rating had been downgraded twice due to cash flow problems. Employee turnover told the real story. In my final year before the accident, turnover had been 8%. People stayed because they felt valued and saw opportunity for growth. Under Daniel's leadership, turnover had reached 45%. Exit interviews consistently mentioned toxic management style and arbitrary The minutes from January 2025 showed that several board members were finally questioning Daniel's leadership. Board meeting minutes, January 18, 2025. Board member Stevens raised concerns about company performance and client satisfaction metrics. CEO Richardson responded that some board members seemed to lack confidence in executive leadership and suggested that changes in board composition might be necessary. Daniel had been preparing to fire board members who questioned him. Just as he'd eliminated employees who showed too much curiosity about his identity, he was transforming my collaborative, people-focused company into a dictatorship run by fear and intimidation. The most recent minutes, March 2025, revealed Daniel's plans for the final destruction of my legacy. Board meeting minutes, March 15, 2025. CEO Richardson proposed sale of company assets and dissolution of Richardson Consulting LLC. Stated that market conditions no longer support traditional consulting models and that liquidation would maximize shareholder value. Daniel had been planning to sell off everything and disappear with the proceeds. He'd systematically destroyed the company's value through incompetence, then wanted to cash out before anyone could hold him accountable for the damage. Reading these minutes, I understood that Daniel's theft went beyond money he'd been destroying my professional reputation and the livelihoods of dozens of employees who'd trusted me. Clients who'd worked with Richardson Consulting during his tenure would never do business with me again, believing I was the one who'd failed them. But the minutes also provided evidence of Daniel's fraud. His signature appeared on every document, and handwriting analysis would prove he'd been forging my identity throughout the corporate takeover. Every decision, every contract, every board resolution was evidence of his crime. Richardson Consulting could be saved, but it would take years to rebuild the reputation and relationships Daniel had destroyed. The real tragedy wasn't the financial losses, it was the betrayal of trust that would follow me for the rest of my career. Daniel hadn't just stolen my company, he'd sabotaged my future. Detective Wilson had assembled a task force that included FBI agents specializing in financial crimes and identity theft. The scope of Daniel's fraud had attracted federal attention, and they wanted to build an airtight case before moving against him. My job was to help them gather evidence while staying hidden from Daniel's view. The first breakthrough came from security. Camera footage that Jennifer had helped us access. Richardson Consulting's building had cameras in every hallway, and the building management had archived 3 years of recordings. What we found was Daniel's nervous behavior documented in high definition. The footage from March 25, 2022, 2 days after my accident, showed Daniel entering my office for the first time as Marcus. Even in grainy security video, his body language screamed guilt. He kept looking over his shoulder, checking to make sure no one was watching as he went through my desk and personal items. Over the following weeks, the cameras captured Daniel's transformation from nervous imposter to confident fraud. We could see him practicing my mannerisms in the elevator, adjusting his posture to match mine, even copying the way I held my phone during calls. It was disturbing to watch someone study my every gesture and expression like an actor preparing for a role, but it was the footage from client meetings that provided the most damning evidence. Daniel's performance during important negotiations was painful to watch. Where I had always been calm and prepared, Daniel was jittery and over-rehearsed. He'd clearly memorized scripts for different scenarios, but when clients asked unexpected questions, he'd panic and make excuses to end meetings early. The security system had also recorded Daniel's private moments in my office. We found footage of him practicing my signature, drinking heavily during work hours, and making frantic phone calls to Dr. Williams when he thought employees were getting suspicious. In one particularly revealing clip, he was seen destroying documents and wiping his computer's hard drive after a board member questioned his decision-making. FBI forensic accountants had been tracing the money trail, and their findings were staggering. Daniel hadn't just stolen from my accounts. He'd created a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts to launder the proceeds. The cryptocurrency investments weren't just bad decisions. They were attempts to hide stolen money and untraceable digital assets. Agent Rebecca Torres, the lead financial crimes investigator, walked me through Daniel's money laundering scheme. Your brother created 5 different LLCs using variations of your name and social security number. He'd transfer money from your legitimate accounts to these shell companies, then use cryptocurrency exchanges to convert the funds to Bitcoin. From there, he moved the money to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The complexity suggested Daniel had been planning this fraud for much longer than I'd initially thought. Setting up shell companies and offshore accounts required advance preparation that couldn't have been done while I was in a coma. Daniel had been laying the groundwork for stealing my identity months or even years before my accident, but Daniel's paranoia had been his downfall. He'd kept detailed records of everything, apparently believing that documentation would legitimize his theft. We found spreadsheets tracking every fraudulent transaction, emails discussing money laundering strategies, and even recordings of phone calls with corrupt medical professionals. The medical fraud evidence was equally comprehensive. Dr. Williams had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges, and she'd provided recordings of conversations with Daniel dating back to my first week at Peaceful Valley. In one recording, Daniel explicitly instructed her to keep me sedated regardless of my recovery progress. I need him stable and unconscious. Daniel's voice was clear on the recording. If he starts showing signs of waking up, increase the dosation. I can't have him recovering until I've secured everything. The recordings proved that Daniel had been deliberately preventing my recovery while living my life. This wasn't just medical fraud, it was attempted murder through medical neglect. Physical evidence was equally damning. FBI agents had searched Daniel's apartment and found a treasure trove of incriminating materials. He'd kept detailed notes about my personality, my business relationships, and my personal history. There were practice sheets where he'd worked on perfecting my signature, and even recordings of my voice that he'd used to study my speech patterns. Most disturbing was Daniel's Marcus Manual, a 200-page document he'd created detailing everything about my life. It included my favorite foods, my political opinions, my sexual preferences, even the way I liked my coffee prepared. He'd essentially created an instruction guide for becoming me. The manual also revealed Daniel's psychological state during the fraud. His notes became increasingly paranoid and self-congratulatory over time. Early entries showed anxiety about being caught, but later pages revealed a man who'd convinced himself he deserved my life more than I did. Handwriting analysis confirmed what we'd suspected. Daniel had been forging my signature on thousands of documents over 3 years. The FBI's forensic document examiner found subtle differences in pressure, angle, and flow that proved the signatures weren't mine. Every contract, every check, every legal document Daniel had signed as me was evidence of fraud, but the most valuable evidence came from Daniel's digital footprint. FBI cybercrime specialists had recovered deleted files from his computer, showing internet searches for how to maintain long-term coma, signs of consciousness in brain injury patients, and legal guardianship duration limits. He'd been researching ways to keep me unconscious indefinitely while maintaining legal control over my assets. Email records showed Daniel had been in contact with criminal organizations, specializing in identity theft and money laundering. He'd paid $50,000 to a group that specialized in creating false medical records, and $25,000 to a lawyer who helped wealthy clients hide assets from law enforcement. The evidence was overwhelming, but Detective Wilson wanted one final piece to seal the case: a recorded confession. That's where I came in. As the actual victim, I could confront Daniel directly and try to get him to admit his crimes on tape. It's risky, Detective Wilson warned. If Daniel realizes what's happening, he might flee the country. We know he has access to private jets and offshore accounts. Once he runs, finding him could take years. But I needed that confession, not just for legal purposes, but for my own closure. I needed to look my brother in the eye and hear him admit what he'd done to me. I needed to understand how someone I'd shared a womb with could destroy my life so completely. The trap was set. Tomorrow, I would confront Daniel and give him the chance to confess. If he refused, the FBI would arrest him and let the evidence speak for itself. Either way, Daniel's perfect crime was about to become his perfect nightmare. The DNA test results arrived that morning, providing scientific proof of what everyone already knew but couldn't quite believe. Dr. Patricia Chen from Metro General had insisted on independent verification before she'd agreed to testify against Dr. Williams and the Peaceful Valley conspiracy. Identical twin DNA can be tricky in legal proceedings, Dr. Chen explained as she handed me the laboratory report. But we used advanced techniques that can differentiate between twins based on environmental factors and cellular mutations. This proves definitively that you are Marcus Richardson, not Daniel. The test results would be crucial in court, but more importantly, they gave me the confidence I needed for what came next. I was about to reveal myself to Sarah, and I needed absolute proof that I was her real fiancé, not another imposter trying to manipulate her grief. Detective Wilson had arranged for the confrontation to take place at the coffee shop where Sarah and I had our first date. The location was public enough to ensure safety, but private enough for an intimate conversation. FBI agents would be positioned throughout the area, ready to intervene if Daniel appeared unexpectedly. Sarah arrived at exactly 2 p.m., punctual as always. She looked around nervously, clearly confused by the mysterious message she'd received asking her to meet someone with information about the real Marcus Richardson. She ordered her usual lavender latte and chose a corner table where we could talk privately. I watched her for a few minutes from across the street, my heart breaking at how fragile she looked. The confident, vibrant woman I'd fallen in love with had been replaced by someone who moved through the world like she was afraid of breaking something precious. Daniel had stolen her joy along with everything else. When I finally entered the coffee shop, Sarah's reaction was immediate and devastating. Her face went white, her hand flew to her mouth, and the latte fell to the floor in a ceramic explosion of broken pieces and hot milk. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "Hello, Sarah. It's really me." She stared at me for what felt like hours, her mind clearly struggling to process what she was seeing. I could see her cataloging every detail of my appearance, comparing it to her memories of the man she'd lost and the man she'd married. "This isn't possible," she said finally. You died. Daniel said you died. The doctors said there was no hope." I sat down across from her, moving slowly to avoid startling her further. "I never died, Sarah. I was in a coma for 3 years, but I was alive the entire time. Daniel has been living as me while keeping me unconscious and hidden away." Her eyes filled with tears, but whether from joy or horror, I couldn't tell. "I don't understand. If you were alive, why didn't Daniel tell me? Why did he let me believe you were gone? Because he wanted my life. He wanted my money, my business, my identity, and he wanted you." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached across the table to touch my face. Her fingers traced the scar on my forehead from the accident, a mark that Daniel didn't have. "It's really you," she breathed. "I can feel it. You're different from him." "Different how?" "Your eyes." Daniel's eyes always seemed like he was performing, like he was trying to convince me of something. "Your eyes are peaceful, real." She pulled back suddenly. "Oh God, Marcus, what have I done? I married your brother. I've been living with him for 2 years, thinking he was you." The pain in her voice was unbearable. "Sarah, you didn't do anything wrong. You were grieving, and Daniel manipulated that grief. You're as much a victim as I am." But she was shaking, her head, tears streaming down her face. "I should have known. I should have felt the difference. There were signs, little things that didn't match my memories of you. But I convinced myself it was brain damage from the accident. I reached for her hands, and she didn't pull away. Tell me about the signs. His laugh was different, louder, more forced. You always laughed quietly, like you were sharing a private joke with yourself. And his touch, she shuddered. It felt familiar, but wrong, like a song played in the wrong key. I kept thinking it was because of the trauma, that my memories were confused. What else? He didn't remember our inside jokes. He'd pretend to, but he'd get the details wrong. And he was spending money differently, impulsively, on things to impress people rather than things that mattered to us. When I mentioned our plan to start a family, he changed the subject. The real Marcus wanted children. Sarah's observations confirmed what I'd suspected. Daniel's performance had been good but not perfect. The people who knew me best had sensed something was wrong, but they'd attributed the changes to brain trauma rather than fraud. Sarah, I need you to know something important. The man you've been living with isn't just an imposter. He's dangerous. We have evidence that he caused my accident deliberately, that he's been bribing doctors to keep me unconscious, and that he's stolen over $15 million. Her face went from shock to horror to anger in rapid succession. He tried to kill you, we think so. And when that didn't work, he decided to steal my life instead. I pulled out the DNA test results. This proves who I really am. But more importantly, I need to know, are you safe? Has Daniel ever threatened you, or shown violent behavior? He's been drinking more lately, and using drugs. Last week he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises when I asked about some financial discrepancies I'd noticed. He apologized and said work stress was getting to him, but she rolled up her sleeve to show fading bruises in the shape of fingerprints. Rage flooded through me. Daniel hadn't just stolen my identity. He'd been abusing the woman I loved while wearing my face. Sarah, you need to leave him immediately. Come stay with Jennifer or go to your sister's house. Don't go back to the penthouse. I can't just disappear. He'll know something's wrong. Something is wrong. Everything about your marriage is built on a lie. Daniel isn't your husband. He's your kidnapper. He stole you from me just as surely as he stole everything else. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what I'd told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and determined. What do we need to do to stop him? The woman I'd fallen in love with was still there, beneath the pain and confusion Daniel had caused. She was ready to fight for the truth, ready to help me reclaim our life together. We're going to expose him, I said. And we're going to make sure he pays for every lie, every theft, every moment of suffering he's caused. Sarah nodded, her tears drying as resolve replaced shock. Tell me how. The confrontation with Daniel had to be perfect. Detective Wilson and I spent hours planning every detail, knowing we'd have only one chance to get him to confess before he realized the trap was closing around him. The key was making him believe he was still in control while we recorded everything. Sarah was crucial to the plan. She would return to the penthouse and act normally, giving no sign that she'd discovered the truth. Meanwhile, I would arrive unexpectedly, using my key to enter the apartment Daniel believed was his. The shock of seeing me would hopefully cause him to panic and reveal his guilt. FBI agents positioned themselves throughout the building while technical specialists set up recording equipment. Every word, every gesture would be captured as evidence. If Daniel confessed to any part of his crimes, we'd have him. I arrived at my own penthouse at 8 p.m., my hands shaking as I put the key in the lock. This was my home, my sanctuary, and Daniel had been living in it for 3 years, like a parasite feeding on my life. The locks hadn't been changed. Another sign of Daniel's arrogance and sense of ownership. The apartment was different but recognizable. My furniture was still there, but Daniel had added expensive art and electronics that screamed nouveau rich. My books were gone, replaced by magazines and empty alcohol bottles. The place felt like a movie set version of my life. All the surface details correct but lacking the soul that made it home. I found Daniel in my study, sitting at my desk, working on my computer. For a moment, looking at him from behind, it was like seeing myself from the outside. We were identical in every physical way, but everything about his posture and mannerisms was wrong. This was how Sarah had felt for 3 years, seeing a familiar face expressing an alien personality. Hello, Daniel. He spun around in the chair, and the look on his face was worth every moment of suffering I'd endured. Pure, undiluted terror. His mouth fell open, his face went pale, and for several seconds he couldn't speak. Marcus, he whispered finally. How? You're supposed to be unconscious, vegetative, dead? I stepped into the room, and he instinctively backed away. Sorry to disappoint you, brother. Daniel's mind was racing, trying to process what my appearance meant for his carefully constructed life. The doctors said you'd never wake up. Dr. Williams said there was no brain activity. Dr. Williams was lying. Just like you've been lying for 3 years. I sat down in the chair across from my own desk. A surreal reversal of power. Nice apartment, by the way. Very expensive renovations for someone living on a guardian's allowance. His face flushed with panic. I don't know what you're talking about. The marble bathroom, Daniel. The imported furniture. The art collection, worth more than most people's houses. All paid for with my money while you kept me drugged and unconscious. Daniel's composure was cracking, but he was still trying to maintain the lie. You're confused, Marcus. You've been in a coma for 3 years? Your memory is probably damaged. I've been managing your estate responsibly. Is that what you call losing $12 million? Responsible management? The specific figure hit him like a physical blow. How could I know the exact amount unless I'd been investigating him? The markets have been volatile. Some investments haven't performed as expected. Cryptocurrency gambling isn't investing, Daniel. Neither is funding. Fake companies are transferring money to offshore accounts. I leaned forward. I know about the shell companies. I know about the Cayman Islands accounts. I know about every fraudulent transaction you've made. His breathing was getting faster, more erratic. The walls were closing in, and he could feel it. You can't prove any of that. I don't need to prove it. You're going to confess it all yourself. That's insane. Why would I confess to anything? Because you're proud of what you've accomplished. For 3 years, you've been the successful twin, the one everyone admires. You've been everything you always wanted to be, me. I pulled out my phone and set it on the desk between us. The recording app clearly visible. Tell me how you did it, Daniel. How did you pull off the perfect crime? His eyes locked onto the phone, but the appeal to his ego was working. Despite his fear, I could see pride flickering across his face. He'd been carrying this secret for 3 years with no one to appreciate his cleverness. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, he said quietly. The accident gave me an opportunity I couldn't pass up. What kind of opportunity? You were unconscious. Probably going to die anyway. I thought, why not use your identity to solve my financial problems? I was about to lose my apartment, Marcus. I was broke, desperate. There it was, the admission that he'd deliberately stolen my identity. But I needed more. So you decided to keep me unconscious while you lived my life. I chose the medical facility that would give you the best care. You chose a facility where patients don't recover. You paid doctors to keep me sedated. Daniel stood up abruptly, his panic overwhelming his caution. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Everyone expected me to make decisions about your care, your business, your life. I was protecting your interests. By stealing $15 million? By keeping everything together while you couldn't? His voice was rising, years of justification, pouring out. Do you know how hard it was to learn your business? To maintain your relationships? To be you every single day? So you admit you've been pretending to be me. The question hung in the air as Daniel realized what he'd said. His face went pale as he understood the trap he'd walked into. I meant managing your affairs while you recovered. No, Daniel. You meant stealing my life. You meant marrying my fiancée while keeping me in an artificial coma. You meant committing the perfect crime. His composure finally shattered completely. Yes, he screamed. Yes, I took your life. And I lived it better than you ever did. Sarah was happier with me. Your business was more successful. Everyone loved the new Marcus Richardson. The confession poured out of him in a torrent of rage and pride and bitter resentment. You had everything handed to you, and you didn't even appreciate it. I made your life matter. I made it exciting. I made it worth living. By putting me in a medically induced coma. By becoming the person you should have been. I picked up my phone, ending the recording. Thank you, Daniel. That confession will put you in federal prison for the rest of your life. The color drained from his face as he realized what he'd done. In his desperate need to justify his actions, he'd admitted to identity theft, fraud, medical conspiracy, and attempted murder. You recorded me, he whispered. I learned from the best. After all, you've been deceiving people for 3 years. The door burst open, and FBI agents flooded the room. Daniel didn't resist as they handcuffed him and read him his rights. As they led him away, he looked back at me one final time. You'll never undo what I've done, he said, his voice filled with venom. I've ruined your reputation, destroyed your relationships, stolen your life. Even if you're free, you'll never really get it back. It was his last act of cruelty, his final attempt to wound me. But as I watched the FBI escort my brother out of my own apartment, I felt only relief. The nightmare was finally over. Detective Wilson appeared in the doorway, looking satisfied. That confession will put him away for decades, she said. Identity theft, medical fraud, attempted murder, conspiracy. He's looking at life in federal prison. Sarah emerged from the bedroom where she'd been hiding, tears streaming down her face. She'd heard everything through the wire I'd been wearing, finally understanding the full scope of Daniel's deception. Is it really over? She asked. It's over, I said, pulling her into my arms for the first time in 3 years. Now we can start rebuilding. The federal courthouse was packed with reporters when Daniel's sentencing hearing began 6 months later. The case had captured national attention: identical twins, stolen identity, attempted murder through medical fraud. Every detail of Daniel's elaborate scheme had been dissected in the media, turning our family tragedy into a cautionary tale about greed and sibling rivalry. I sat in the front row next to Sarah, watching as my brother was led into the courtroom in shackles. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by months in federal custody. The confident imposter who'd stolen my life had been replaced by a broken man facing the consequences of his crimes. The federal fraud indictment was devastating in its thoroughness. 47 separate charges ranging from identity theft and wire fraud to conspiracy to commit murder. Each count carried potential decades in prison, and the evidence was overwhelming. Daniel's own recorded confession had sealed his fate, but the FBI had uncovered additional crimes even I hadn't known about. Agent Torres read the financial damage assessment to the court. The defendant stole or misappropriated $15.7 million in assets belonging to Marcus Richardson. Additionally, insurance fraud totaling $847,000, tax evasion exceeding $200,000, and money laundering through shell companies involving $3.2 million in illegal transfers. The medical conspiracy charges were equally damning. Dr. Williams had already been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for her role in keeping me sedated. 3 other medical professionals faced charges, and Peaceful Valley Extended Care had lost its license and faced massive civil lawsuits. But it was the attempted murder charge that carried the most weight. The prosecution had reconstructed the night of my accident with forensic precision. Daniel's cell phone records showed he'd been following me for over an hour before the crash. Toxicology reports revealed traces of a sedative in my system that hadn't been explained by emergency room treatment, evidence that Daniel had drugged me before causing the accident. Your Honor, Prosecutor Janet Morrison addressed the court, this was not a crime of passion or opportunity. Daniel Richardson spent months planning to steal his brother's identity, attempted to murder him when the plan required it, and then spent 3 years systematically destroying everything Marcus Richardson had built. This represents the most elaborate and callous identity theft case this court has ever seen. Daniel's defense attorney tried to argue for leniency based on mental health issues and sibling rivalry trauma, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. When Judge Harrison asked if Daniel had anything to say before sentencing, my brother stood slowly and looked directly at me. For a moment I thought he might finally show remorse, might acknowledge the pain he'd caused. Instead, he said, I gave you a better life than you ever would have lived on your own. Sarah was happier with me. Your business was more successful. Your reputation was stronger. You should be thanking me. Even facing life in prison, Daniel couldn't admit he'd done anything wrong. In his twisted mind, he'd improved my life by stealing it. The narcissism that had driven his crimes remained intact even as his world collapsed around him. Judge Harrison's response was swift and merciless. Mr. Richardson, your complete lack of remorse and continued justification of your crimes demonstrates that you remain a danger to society. This court sentences you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down with finality. Daniel would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and I would never have to fear him again. As the marshals led him away, he didn't look back. The brother I'd once shared a womb with was gone forever, replaced by a stranger who destroyed everything I held dear. But justice in the courtroom was only the beginning of my recovery. The civil asset forfeiture proceedings had recovered most of my stolen money, but rebuilding trust and relationships would take much longer. 3 years of Daniel's incompetent management had destroyed Richardson Consulting's reputation, and several former clients had filed lawsuits based on his failures. Sarah and I had been attending counseling together, working through the trauma of her inadvertent marriage to my attempted murderer. She struggled with guilt and betrayal, questioning every memory of our relationship and wondering how she could have been so thoroughly deceived. I feel like I don't know what's real anymore, she'd said during one particularly difficult session. If I could be fooled so completely about something so fundamental, how can I trust my own judgment about anything? The healing process was slow and painful, but we were making progress. Sarah had moved back into the penthouse with me, and we were slowly rebuilding the intimacy that Daniel had corrupted with his lies. It helped that she could see the differences between us now. The way I listened to her concerns instead of dismissing them, the way I remembered details about her preferences and dreams, the way I touched her with genuine love instead of calculated manipulation. Detective Wilson had become something of a friend during the investigation, and she attended the sentencing hearing to see the case concluded. Your brother was one of the most manipulative criminals I've ever encountered, she told me afterward, but his arrogance was his downfall. He couldn't resist bragging about his perfect crime. The media attention was both helpful and exhausting. My story had inspired discussions about medical fraud, guardianship abuse, and identity theft prevention, but it also meant that every business interaction began with people recognizing me as the twin whose brother stole his life. Still, as I walked out of the courthouse with Sarah's hand in mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Closure. Daniel's sentence wouldn't undo the damage he'd caused, but it ensured he could never hurt anyone again. The legal system had worked. Justice had been served, and my nightmare was officially over. Now came the harder challenge, rebuilding a life worth stealing in the first place. 18 months after Daniel's sentencing, I signed the documents to officially relaunch Richardson Consulting under a new name, Phoenix Strategic Solutions. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it felt appropriate. Like the mythical bird, my business was rising from the ashes of what Daniel had destroyed. Jennifer Martinez had agreed to return as my executive vice president, bringing with her 3 other employees who'd been fired during Daniel's reign of incompetence. The new company charter I'd created included strict safeguards against the kind of fraud Daniel had perpetrated, multiple signature requirements for major transactions, independent board oversight, and mandatory background checks. For anyone with financial authority, it feels good to be working for the real Marcus again, Jennifer said as we toured our new offices. I'd deliberately chosen a different building, wanting to start fresh rather than trying to reclaim spaces tainted by Daniel's presence. The energy is completely different. People actually want to come to work now. Rebuilding my client base had been the biggest challenge. Daniel's failures had cost me relationships I'd spent years developing, and convincing people to trust me again required proving that I wasn't the man who'd disappointed them. Some clients refused to even take my calls, too burned by their experience with my impostor to risk another relationship with anyone named Richardo, but others had been willing to listen when I explained what had really happened. Morrison Industries, the $2 million account Daniel had lost through arrogance, agreed to a small pilot project that let me demonstrate the difference between my approach and his. Within 6 months, they'd renewed their full contract and recommended us to 2 other companies. The media attention, initially overwhelming, had become an unexpected asset. My story had resonated with people who'd experienced family betrayal or professional fraud. Several new clients specifically sought us out because they felt they could trust someone who'd survived such an elaborate deception. Sarah and I had made our own fresh start. 6 months after Daniel's sentencing, I'd proposed to her again, properly this time, with a new ring and a ceremony that wouldn't be overshadowed by lies and theft. Our wedding was small and private, attended only by people who knew the real story and supported our journey toward healing. "Are you sure you want to take my name again?" I'd asked her during our engagement. "After everything Daniel put you through wearing it, I'm taking your name," she'd replied firmly. "Not his. There's a difference, and I refuse to let his crimes steal that from us too." Our honeymoon was deliberately low-key, a week in a cabin in Colorado where we could reconnect without phones, reporters, or reminders of the past 3 years. For the first time since my awakening, we talked about the future instead of the past, making plans that belonged to us alone. Sarah had started her own marketing consultancy, wanting the independence that came with building something entirely her own. Her experience with Daniel had taught her the importance of maintaining her identity separate from mine, and I supported her desire for professional autonomy. "I need to know I can trust my own judgment," she'd explained. "Daniel made me doubt everything about myself, building my own business, making my own decisions. It's helping me remember who I am when I'm not defined by someone else." The financial recovery had been more successful than expected. The FBI's asset forfeiture efforts had recovered $11.8 million of the stolen money, and civil lawsuits against the medical professionals had yielded another $2.3 million in damages. I wasn't back to my pre-accident net worth, but I was financially stable enough to rebuild properly. My parents had struggled with the revelation of Daniel's crimes. They had spent 3 years believing they had one successful son and one son fighting for his life in a medical facility. Learning that their devoted son was actually an attempted murderer who'd been stealing from their other son had shattered their understanding of their own family. "We should have seen the signs," my mother had said through tears during one of our reconciliation conversations. "Daniel was always jealous of your success, but we never thought. No one could have predicted this, Mom. Daniel fooled everyone, including medical professionals and federal investigators. You can't blame yourself for not seeing through a deception this elaborate." The relationship with my parents was slowly healing, but it would never be the same. They'd lost one son to prison and nearly lost another to murder, and the guilt of having favored their attempted murderer would haunt them forever. I'd also had to confront the uncomfortable reality that some of Daniel's criticisms of me had been valid. I had been a workaholic who prioritized business success over personal relationships. I had taken my advantages for granted and failed to understand my brother's struggles with feeling overshadowed. None of that justified what he'd done, but it had motivated me to live differently. Phoenix Strategic Solutions operated with more flexible policies and better work-life balance. I made time for regular date nights with Sarah, took actual vacations, and invested in relationships rather than just accumulating wealth. "You're different now," Sarah had observed one evening as we cooked dinner together in our new apartment. "More present, more thoughtful about what really matters. Nearly dying and losing everything has a way of clarifying your priorities," I'd replied. "Daniel stole 3 years of my life, but maybe he inadvertently taught me how to live the years I have left." The new company was already profitable and growing. More importantly, it was built on a foundation of trust, transparency, and genuine relationships rather than just financial success. I'd learned that reputation was more valuable than money, and that the connections you build with people matter more than the assets you accumulate. Phoenix Strategic Solutions was becoming exactly what Richardson Consulting should have been: a company that succeeded by helping others succeed, led by someone who understood the difference between having a life and living one. Daniel had tried to destroy me, but his betrayal had ultimately made me stronger. From the ashes of his crimes, I was building something better than what I'd lost. 5 years after waking up from my 3-year nightmare, I sat in my lawyer's office signing the final documents of my new family trust. The papers spread across the mahogany desk represented more than just estate planning. They were my insurance policy against ever being vulnerable to family betrayal again. The trust structure ensures that no individual family member can ever gain control over your assets, my attorney explained. Independent trustees, multiple signature requirements, and mandatory waiting periods for major decisions. Even if you were incapacitated again, your wealth would be protected. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using the legal system to protect myself from the very family bonds that had once given my life meaning. But Daniel's betrayal had taught me that blood relations meant nothing when money and power were at stake. Sarah squeezed my hand as I signed the final page. We'd been married for 3 years now, 3 years of genuine partnership built on truth rather than deception. Our relationship was stronger than it had ever been before the accident, forged in the fire of shared trauma and mutual healing. "Do you ever regret not having children?" she asked as we walked to our car. It was a conversation we'd been having more frequently as we approached our late 30s. "I used to think I wanted kids," I admitted, "but after what Daniel did, the idea of creating another generation that might inherit his capacity for betrayal terrifies me. You're not Daniel, Marcus, and our children wouldn't be him either." It was an ongoing discussion without easy answers. Daniel's crimes had infected my ability to trust even my own genetic legacy. What if we had twins? What if one child grew up resenting the other's success? What if I created the same toxic dynamic that had driven my brother to attempted murder? Phoenix Strategic Solutions had exceeded all my expectations for rebuilding. We were now a $20 million company with 43 employees and offices in 3 cities. More importantly, we'd built a reputation for ethical business practices and employee satisfaction that would have been impossible under my old workaholic approach. I'd started speaking at conferences about business ethics and fraud prevention, sharing my story to help others avoid similar devastation. The presentations were emotionally draining, but professionally rewarding. My experience had become a cautionary tale that resonated with executives worldwide. The hardest part wasn't the financial losses. I would tell audiences it was learning that the person I trusted most in the world saw my success as something to be stolen rather than celebrated. Family relationships are built on assumed loyalty, but that assumption can be your greatest vulnerability. The speaking engagements had led to consulting opportunities with companies implementing fraud prevention measures. We'd developed specialized services helping family-owned businesses create safeguards against internal theft and abuse of authority. My trauma had become a marketable expertise. Dr. Patricia Chen, the neurologist whose early recommendations Daniel had ignored, had become both a friend and a regular consultant. She helped us develop protocols for companies dealing with executive medical emergencies, ensuring that temporary authority transfers couldn't become permanent power grabs. "Your case changed how we approach guardianship situations," she told me during a recent lunch meeting. "Medical facilities now have mandatory multiple doctor approvals for long-term sedation protocols, and courts require independent advocacy for incapacitated patients." Daniel's crimes had led to systemic changes that would protect future victims. The medical fraud he'd perpetrated had exposed vulnerabilities in the healthcare system that regulators were working to address. His perfect crime had become a catalyst for imperfect but necessary reforms. I'd received several letters from Daniel over the years, all returned unopened. I had no interest in his justifications, apologies, or continued manipulations. Some wounds were too deep for forgiveness, and some betrayals too fundamental to overcome. My brother was dead to me in every way that mattered. My parents had struggled with my decision to cut off all contact with Daniel. They visited him in prison and maintained hope for eventual reconciliation, but I'd made it clear that any relationship with him would mean losing their relationship with me. They'd chosen their surviving son over their incarcerated one, but the decision had aged them considerably. The financial recovery had been complete, and then some. My net worth now exceeded what it had been before the accident, but the money felt different. It was security rather than achievement, protection rather than prosperity. I'd learned that wealth without relationships was meaningless. But I'd also learned that relationships without boundaries were dangerous. Sarah and I had bought a house in a gated community with extensive security systems. The precautions weren't just about general crime. They were specifically designed to prevent anyone from accessing our lives the way Daniel had accessed mine. Privacy had become a necessity rather than a preference. "Do you think you'll ever feel completely safe again?" Sarah asked one evening as we watched the sunset from our secure patio. "I don't think safety is the right goal," I replied. "I think awareness is better. I know now that anyone can betray you, that any relationship can turn toxic, that success makes you a target even within your own family. That knowledge is protection itself." The man who'd woken up in that hospital bed 5 years ago had been naive about human nature and overconfident about family loyalty. The man I'd become was wiser but lonelier, successful but guarded, wealthy but isolated by necessary caution. I had survived Daniel's perfect crime, but I hadn't emerged unchanged. His betrayal had made me stronger in some ways and smaller in others. I was more successful professionally but less trusting personally. I had more money but fewer close relationships. I'd gained security but lost innocence. Looking back, I sometimes wondered if Daniel had been right about one thing, whether I'd taken my advantages for granted and failed to appreciate what I had. His crimes had forced me to examine my life more carefully, to value relationships over achievements, to prioritize meaning over money. But those lessons had come at a cost too high to justify. 3 years of my life, millions of dollars, countless relationships, and my fundamental ability to trust. These were prices no one should have to pay for personal growth. As I sat in my secure home with my recovered fortune and my rebuilt life, I realized that Daniel's ultimate failure hadn't been getting caught. His ultimate failure had been believing that stealing my life would give him the happiness he'd never found in his own. He'd discovered, too late, that other people's lives never fit quite right. Success stolen rather than earned feels hollow. Love obtained through deception turns bitter. Identity borrowed from someone else never feels authentic. Daniel had spent 3 years living as me, but he'd never learned how to be himself. That, more than any prison sentence, was his real punishment. I'd learned to be a better version of myself, and that was my real victory.